In this lesson, we'll learn how fracturing can be used to break apart and shatter our RealFlow objects. Okay, so for this example, I'm just going to start with a blank scene here. So let's go ahead and just set up something to be able to use. So we'll start with a basic plane. And we'll start off with something like a cross here as well. So this will be the actual piece of geometry that we shatter. So let's go ahead and we'll take this piece of geometry and just move this up to where it's sitting just above this ground plane. So something like 1.51 maybe, so it's just above that plane, so that way it won't have very far to fall before it actually makes contact. So we have this main object here. Now, to take this and actually fracture it, it's a very, very simple process, so just select your object and then come right up here to the fracture command. So click on this. We have the option to choose just how many pieces we actually want to have this shatter apart into. The default is 20, and I find that that works pretty well for most situations, but really it's just up to you as far as how many actual chunks you want your object to break apart into. And then we have the seed, which the seed is really just the randomization algorithm that it uses to break this apart, so you'll get different shapes depending on which seed you use. So with that, let's go ahead and just press OK. And now you can see we have our fractured object here. So we actually have two versions of this cross. We have the original, and now we have this one that's been fractured apart. So what we could do is take this original, maybe just hide that to get that out of the way. And we can take this new fractured one, and maybe just give that a slightly different color so it's a little bit easier to see. And now at this point, it really just behaves like a normal rigid body object. So we can drop in something like gravity and make sure that this floor is set to be a passive rigid body because we want it to actually catch the fragments as they start to fall. And then the last thing you need to do is actually take this fracture object and make sure that it is set to be an active rigid body. And now with that set, we can go ahead and reset our timeline. Press the A key on our keyboard to start this simulation process. And now you can see our object is starting to fall apart. Okay, so letting that play through, we'll go ahead and stop the simulation at that point. So we'll call this good at about 160 frames. Should work just fine in my case. Let that just simulate for those last couple frames here. And now you can see our object is really just sort of falling and breaking apart. Now, as far as the overall controls for this, you can see that they are very, very similar to our normal rigid body parameters. So things like density, how dense this object is, basically how much it weighs. This can also determine if you start to have fluids and things like that that are interacting with these different fragments, whether or not those fragments are actually going to float on top of the water or if they're going to sink down below the water's surface. Again, these are things that are controlled by the density. And then we also have things like velocity, rotation, object friction. Again, these are the exact same attributes that we saw earlier whenever we were talking about our rigid body objects. Now, you'll notice that as we start to play through this, you can see that pretty much from the exact moment our simulation starts, our object starts to crumble and fall apart. Now, what if we actually didn't want this to crumble immediately? What if we actually wanted this to be crumbled or shattered by some other object that's coming in? So what we could actually do is use this passive switch. So with this set to no, that basically means that this is going to be an active object, which means it's going to start falling apart and start reacting to forces. If we set the passive option to yes and come in and resimulate, you can see that really nothing is happening. It's at this point just waiting for something to collide with it. So what we could actually do is just keyframe this passive option on or off whenever an object starts to come close to it that we actually want it to break apart. So for example, if we had something like a sphere, and if I were to pull this over, and let's just try to set this up for a rigid body simulation. So I'm going to take my sphere, make this into an active rigid body, go into the rigid body parameters here, and I want it to move along this x-axis, so let's give it a little bit of a velocity here. Let's start with maybe something like 8. There we go. So a little bit better. Let's maybe give it a little bit of upward motion here as well. Maybe an upward motion of 5. There we go. So let's start with something like that. Now, let's take our little cross here, and let's try to find about the point where the sphere gets closed, so about frame 24. Now let's go back to our cross here, and at about frame 24, we'll go ahead and add a key for the passive set to yes. We'll move forward one frame to 25, just using the left and right arrow keys on my keyboard. We'll go over here. Let's go ahead and set the passive to no, and now keyframe that. So now at frame 24, it's set to be passive, but as soon as it gets to frame 25, now it's going to start falling apart. So now, set this simulation off again. You can see now it's starting to think. And now you can see our object is being shattered by our other active rigid body. We could actually come in and maybe set this mass up a little bit higher for this little sphere. So maybe give that a much higher mass. There we are. So now that should start to break this object apart with a lot more force, and you can see now that's what's starting to happen. All right, very nice. So you can start to see where these fracture techniques start to become really, really useful for just being able to come in, break our objects apart, either based on gravity or other rigid body objects. We can actually even have things like fluids and other emitters start to react and push these fracture objects apart as well. So that's a look at how we can start to set up these types of shattering effects within RealFlow.